1967, it was reported by Science magazine that at the U.S. Government Center in Fort Detrick, Maryland, dengue fever was amongst those diseases that are at least the objects of considerable research and that appear to be among those regarded as potential BW, biological warfare agents. Then, in 1984, a Cuban exile on trial in New York testified that in the latter part of 1980 a ship traveled from Florida to Cuba with a mission to carry some germs to introduce them in Cuba to be used against the Soviets and against the Cuban economy, to begin what was called chemical war, which later on produced results that were not what we had expected, because we thought that it was going to be used against the Soviet forces, and it was used against our own people, and with that we did not agree. It's not clear from the testimony whether the Cuban man thought that the germs would somehow be able to confine their actions to only Russians, or whether he had been misled by the people behind the operation. The full extent of American chemical and biological warfare against Cuba will never be known. Over the years, the Castro government has in fact blamed the United States for a number of other plagues which afflicted various animals and crops. And in 1977, newly released CIA documents disclosed that the agency maintained a clandestine anti-crop warfare research program targeted during the 1960s at a number of countries throughout the world. It came to pass that the United States felt the need to put some of its chemical and biological warfare, CBW expertise, into the hands of other nations. As of 1969, some 550 students from 36 countries had completed courses at the U.S. Army's Chemical School at Fort McClellan, Alabama. The CBW instruction was provided to the students under the guise of defense against such weapons, just as in Vietnam, as we have seen, torture was taught. As will be described in the chapter on Uruguay, the manufacture and use of bombs was taught under the cover of combating terrorist bombings. The ingenuity which went into the chemical and biological warfare against Cuba was apparent in some of the dozens of plans to assassinate or humiliate Fidel Castro. Devised by the CIA or Cuban exiles with the cooperation of American mafiosi, the plans ranged from poisoning Castro's cigars and food to a chemical designed to make his hair and beard fall off and LSD to be administered just before a public speech. There were also, of course, the more traditional approaches of gun and bomb, one being an attempt to drop bombs on a baseball stadium while Castro was speaking. The B-26 bomber was driven away by anti-aircraft fire before it could reach the stadium. It is a combination of such Cuban security measures, informers, incompetence, and luck which has served to keep the bearded one alive to the present day. Attempts were also made on the lives of Castro's brother Raul and Che Guevara. The latter was the target of a bazooka fired at the United Nations building in New York in December 1964. Various Cuban exile groups have engaged in violence on a regular basis in the United States with relative impunity for decades. One of them, going by the name of Omega 7 and headquartered in Union City, New Jersey, was characterized by the FBI in 1980 as the most dangerous terrorist organization in the United States. Attacks against Cuba itself began to lessen around the end of the 1960s, due probably to a lack of satisfying results combined with aging warriors, and exile groups turned to targets in the United States and elsewhere in the world. During the next decade, while the CIA continued to pour money into the exile community, more than 100 serious incidents took place in the United States for which Omega 7 and other groups claimed responsibility. Within the community, the distinction between a terrorist and a non-terrorist group is not especially precise. There is much overlapping identity and frequent creation of new names. There occurred repeated bombings of the Soviet UN mission, its Washington embassy, its automobiles, a Soviet ship docked in New Jersey, the offices of the Soviet airline Aeroflot, with a number of Russians injured from these attacks. Several bombings of the Cuban UN mission and its interest section in Washington, many attacks upon Cuban diplomats, including at least one murder. A bomb discovered at New York's Academy of Music in 1976 shortly before a celebration of the Cuban Revolution was to begin. A bombing 2 years later of the Lincoln Center after the Cuban ballet had performed. The single most violent act of this period was the blowing up of a Cubana Airlines plane shortly after it took off from Barbados on October 6, 1976, which took the lives of 73 people, including the entire Cuban championship fencing team. CIA documents later revealed that on June 22nd, a CIA officer abroad had cabled a report to agency headquarters that he had learned from a source that a Cuban exile group planned to bomb a Cubana airliner flying between Panama and Havana. The group's leader was a baby doctor named Orlando Bosch. After the plane crashed in the sea in October, it was Bosch's network of exiles that claimed responsibility. The cable showed that the CIA had the means to penetrate the Bosch organization, but there's no indication in any of the documents that the agency undertook any special monitoring of Bosch and his group because of their plans, or that the CIA warned Havana. In 1983, while Orlando Bosch sat in a Venezuelan prison charged with masterminding the plane bombing, the City Commission of Miami proclaimed a Dr. Orlando Bosch Day. In 1968, Bosch had been convicted of a bazooka attack on a Polish ship in Miami. Cuban exiles themselves have often come in for harsh treatment. Those who have visited Cuba for any reason whatever or publicly suggested, however timidly, a rapprochement with the homeland, they too have been the victims of bombings and shootings in Florida and New Jersey. American groups advocating a resumption of diplomatic relations or an end to the embargo have been similarly attacked, as have travel agencies handling trips to Cuba and a pharmaceutical company in New Jersey which shipped medicines to the island. Dissent in Miami has been effectively silenced, while the police, city officials, and the media look the other way, when not actually demonstrating support for the exiles' campaign of intimidation. In Miami and elsewhere, the CIA, ostensibly to uncover Castro agents, has employed exiles to spy on their countrymen, to keep files on them, as well as on Americans who associate with them. Although there has always been the extreme lunatic fringe in the Cuban exile community, as opposed to the normal lunatic fringe, insisting that Washington has sold out their cause, over the years there has been only the occasional arrest and conviction of an exile for a terrorist attack in the United States, so occasional that the exiles can only assume that Washington's heart is not wholly in it. The exile groups and their key members are well known to the authorities, for the anti-Castroites have not excessively shied away from publicity. At least as late as the early 1980s, they were training openly in southern Florida and southern California. Pictures of them flaunting their weapons appeared in the press. The CIA, with its countless contacts cum informers amongst the exiles, could fill in many of the missing pieces for the FBI and the police, if it wished to. In 1980, in a detailed report on Cuban exile terrorism, the Village Voice of New York reported, 2 stories were squeezed out of New York police officials. "You know, it's funny," said one cautiously. "There have been 1 or 2 things, but let's put it this way. You get just so far on a case and suddenly the dust is blown away. Case closed. You ask the CIA to help, and they say they aren't really interested. You get the message." Another investigator said he was working on a narcotics case involving Cuban exiles a couple of years ago, and telephone records he obtained showed a frequently dialed number in Miami. He said he traced the number to a company called Zodiac, which turned out to be a CIA front. He dropped his investigation. In 1961, amid much fanfare, the Kennedy administration unveiled its showpiece program, the Alliance for Progress. Conceived as a direct response to Castro's Cuba, it was meant to prove that genuine social change could take place in Latin America without resort to revolution or socialism. If the only alternatives for the people of Latin America are the status quo and communism, said John F. Kennedy, then they will inevitably choose communism. The multi-billion-dollar alliance program established for itself an ambitious set of goals which it hoped to achieve by the end of the decade. These had to do with economic growth, more equitable distribution of national income, reduced unemployment, agrarian reform, education, housing, health, etc. In 1970, the 20th Century Fund of New York, whose list of officers read like a who's who in the government/industry revolving door world, undertook a study to evaluate how close the alliance had come to realizing its objectives. One of the study's conclusions was that Cuba, which was not one of the recipient countries, had come closer to some of the alliance objectives than most alliance members. In education and public health, no country in Latin America has carried out such ambitious and nationally comprehensive programs. Cuba's agrarian reform program as well was recognized as having been more wide-sweeping than that of any other Latin American country, although the study took a wait-and-see attitude towards its results. These and other economic and social gains were achieved despite the U.S. embargo and the inordinate amount of resources and labor Cuba was obliged to devote to defense and security because of the hovering giant to the north. Moreover, though not amongst the stated objectives of the alliance, there was another area of universal importance in which Cuba stood apart from many of its Latin neighbors. There were no legions of desaparecidos, no death squads, no systematic, routine torture. Cuba had become what Washington had always feared from the Third World, a good example. Parallel to the military and economic belligerence, the United States has long maintained a relentless propaganda offensive against Cuba. A number of examples of this occurring in other countries can be found in other chapters of this book. In addition to its vast overseas journalistic empire, the CIA has maintained anti-Castro news article factories in the United States for decades. The agency has reportedly subsidized at times such publications in Miami as Avance, El Mundo, El Prensa Libre, Bohemia, and El Diario de las Americas, as well as AIP, a radio news agency that produced programs sent free of charge to more than 100 small stations in Latin America. 2 CIA fronts in New York, Foreign Publications, Inc., and Editor's Press Service, also served as part of the propaganda network. Was it inevitable that the United States would attempt to topple the Cuban government? Could relations between the two neighboring countries have taken a different path? Based on the American record of invariable hostility towards even moderately leftist governments, the answer would appear to be that there's no reason to believe that Cuba's revolutionary government could have been an exception. Washington officials, however, were not immediately ill-disposed towards the Cuban Revolution. There were those who even expressed their tentative approval or optimism. This was evidently based on the belief that what had taken place in Cuba was little more than another Latin American change in government, the kind which had occurred with monotonous regularity for over a century, where the names and faces change but subservience to the United States remains fixed. Then Castro revealed himself to be cut from a wholly different cloth. It was not to be business as usual in the Caribbean. He soon became outspoken in his criticism of the United States. He referred acrimoniously to the 60 years of American control of Cuba. How, at the end of those 60 years, the masses of Cubans found themselves impoverished. How the United States used the sugar quota as a threat. He spoke of the unacceptable presence of the Guantanamo base. And he made it clear enough to Washington that Cuba would pursue a policy of independence and neutralism in the Cold War. It was for just such reasons that Castro and Che Guevara had forsaken the prosperous bourgeois careers awaiting them in law and medicine to lead the revolution in the first place. Serious compromise was not on their agenda, nor on Washington's, which was not prepared to live with such men and such a government. A National Security Council meeting of March 10, 1959 included on its agenda the feasibility of bringing another government to power in Cuba. This was before Castro had nationalized any U.S. property. The following month, after meeting with Castro in Washington, Vice President Richard Nixon wrote a memo in which he stated that he was convinced that Castro was either incredibly naive about communism or under communist discipline, and that the Cuban leader would have to be treated and dealt with accordingly. Nixon later wrote that his opinion at this time was a minority one within the Eisenhower administration. But before the year was over, CIA Director Allen Dulles had decided that an invasion of Cuba was necessary. In March of 1960, it was approved by President Eisenhower. Then came the embargo, leaving Castro no alternative but to turn more and more to the Soviet Union, thus confirming in the minds of Washington officials that Castro was indeed a communist. Some speculated that he had been a covert Red all along. In this context, it's interesting to note that the Cuban Communist Party had long supported Batista, had served in his cabinet, and had been unsupportive of Castro and his followers until their accession to power appeared imminent. To add to the irony, during 1957 to 58, the CIA was channeling funds to Castro's movement. This while the US continued to support Batista with weapons to counter the rebels. In all likelihood, another example of the agency hedging its bets. If Castro had toned down his early rhetoric and observed the usual diplomatic niceties, but still pursued the policies of self-determination and socialism which he felt were best for Cuba, or inescapable if certain changes were to be realized, he could only have postponed the day of reckoning, and that not for long. Jacobo Arbenz of Guatemala, Mossadegh of Iran, Chetty Juggin of British Guiana, and other third world leaders have gone out of their way to avoid stepping on Washington's very sensitive toes unnecessarily, and were much less radical in their programs and in their stance toward the United States than Castro. Nonetheless, all of them fell under the CIA axe. In 1996, it was revealed that in August 1961, for months after the Bay of Pigs, Che Guevara had met with Richard Goodwin, President Kennedy's assistant special counsel, at an international gathering in Uruguay. Guevara had a message for Kennedy. Cuba was prepared to forswear any political alliance with the Soviet bloc, pay for confiscated American properties and trade, and consider curbing Cuba's support for leftist insurgencies in other countries. In return, the US would cease all hostile actions against Cuba. Back in Washington, Goodwin's advice to the president was to quietly intensify economic pressure on Cuba. In November, Kennedy authorized Operation Mongoose.
31 Indonesia 1965,
liquidating President Sukarno and 500,000 others, armed with wide-bladed knives called parangs. Muslim bands crept at night into the homes of communists, killing entire families. Travelers tell of small rivers and streams that have been literally clogged with bodies. River transportation has at places been seriously impeded. Time magazine, December 1965. Nearly 100 communists or suspected communists were herded into the town's botanical garden and mowed down with a machine gun. The head that had belonged to the school principal, a PKI, Communist Party member, was stuck on a pole and paraded among his former pupils, convened in special assembly. New York Times, May 1966. Estimates of the total number of Indonesians murdered over a period of several years following an aborted coup range from 500,000 to 1 million. In the early morning hours of October 1st, 1965, a small force of junior military officers abducted and killed 6 generals and seized several key points in the capital city of Jakarta. They then went on the air to announce that their action was being taken to forestall a putsch by a general's council scheduled for Army Day, the 5th of October. The putsch, they said, had been sponsored by the CIA and was aimed at capturing power from President Sukarno. By the end of the day, however, the rebel officers in Jakarta had been crushed by the army under the direction of General Suharto, although some supportive army groups in other cities held out for a day or two longer. Suharto, a man who had served both the Dutch colonialists and the Japanese invaders, and his colleagues charged that the large and influential PKI was behind the junior officers' coup attempt, and that behind the party stood Communist China. The triumphant armed forces moved in to grab the reins of government, curb Sukarno's authority. Before long he was reduced to little more than a figurehead, and carry out a bloodbath to eliminate once and for all the PKI with whom Sukarno had obliged them to share national power for many years. Here at last was the situation which could legitimate these long-desired actions. Anti-communist organizations and individuals, particularly Muslims, were encouraged to join in the slaying of anyone suspected of being a PKI sympathizer. Indonesians of Chinese descent as well fell victim to crazed zealots. The Indonesian people were stirred up in part by the display of photographs on television and in the press of the badly decomposed bodies of the slain generals. The men, the public was told, had been castrated and their eyes gouged out by communist women. The army later made the mistake of allowing official medical autopsies to be included as evidence in some of the trials, and the extremely detailed reports of the injuries suffered mentioned only bullet wounds and some bruises, no eye gougings or castration. What ensued was called by the New York Times one of the most savage mass slaughters of modern political history. Violence, wrote Life magazine, tinged not only with fanaticism but with bloodlust and something like witchcraft. 25 years later, American diplomats disclosed that they had systematically compiled comprehensive lists of communist operatives, from top echelons down to village cadres, and turned over as many as 5,000 names to the Indonesian army, which hunted those persons down and killed them. The Americans would then check off the names of those who had been killed or captured. Robert Martins, a former member of the U.S. Embassy's political section in Jakarta, stated in 1990, "It really was a big help to the army. They probably killed a lot of people, and I probably have a lot of blood on my hands, but that's not all bad. There's a time when you have to strike hard at a decisive moment. I know we had a lot more information about the PKI than the Indonesians themselves," said Marshall Green, U.S. ambassador to Indonesia at the time of the coup. Martins told me on a number of occasions that the government did not have very good information on the communist setup, and he gave me the impression that this information was superior to anything they had. No one cared, as long as they were communists, that they were being butchered, said Howard Fetterspiel, who in 1965 was the Indonesia expert at the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. No one was getting very worked up about it. Although the former deputy CIA station chief in Indonesia, Joseph Lazarsky, and former diplomat Edward Masters, who was Martin's boss, confirmed that CIA officers contributed in drawing up the death lists, the CIA in Langley categorically denied any involvement. The massacre put a horrific end to the well-organized PKI national organization. But it did not put to rest the basic questions underlying the events of 1965, to wit, was there in actual fact a general's council aiming to take over the government within a matter of days? A semi-official account of the whole affair published in Indonesia in 1968 denied the existence of the council. However, a study written and published by the CIA the same year confirmed that there was indeed a general's council, but that its purpose was only to devise a way to protect itself from a purported plan of Sukarno to crush the army. What was the nature and extent, if any, of PKI involvement in the alleged coup attempt? Did some members of the party know of the junior officers' plans in advance and simply lend moral support, or did they take a more active role? The semi-official account stated that the PKI's aim was not to seize political power for itself, but to prevent the army from eliminating the party after Sukarno's death. Sukarno had suffered a kidney attack in August, although he quickly recovered. His part in the affair also remains largely a mystery. The CIA study comes to a similar conclusion. It now seems clear that the Indonesian coup was not a move to overthrow Sukarno and/or the established government of Indonesia. Essentially, it was a purge of the army leadership. What was the role, if any, of the CIA? Was the coup attempt instigated by an agent provocateur who spread the story of the General's Council and its imminent putsch? The killing, or even the abduction, of the 6 generals probably could not have been foreseen. 3 of them were actually slain resisting abduction. Was PKI participation induced to provide the excuse for its destruction? There are, in fact, indications of an agent provocateur in the unfolding drama. One Kamaruzzaman bin Ahmed Mubeda, known as Sham. According to the later testimony of some of the arrested officers, it was Sham who pushed the idea of the hostile General's Council and for the need to counteract it. At the trials and in the CIA study, the attempt is made to establish that, in so doing, Sham was acting on behalf of PKI leader Aden. Presentation of this premise may explain why the CIA took the unique step of publishing such a book, i.e., to assign responsibility for the coup attempt to the PKI so as to justify the horror which followed. But Sham could just as easily have been acting for the CIA and/or the generals in the same manner. He apparently was a trusted aide of Aden and could have induced the PKI leader into the plot instead of the other way around. Sham had a politically checkered and mysterious background, and his testimony at one of the trials, in which he appeared as a defendant, was aimed at establishing Aden as the sole director of the coup attempt. The CIA, in its intimate involvement in Indonesian political affairs since at least the mid-1950s, see Indonesia 1957-58 chapter, had undoubtedly infiltrated the PKI at various levels, and the military even more so, and was thus in a good position to disseminate disinformation and plant the ideas for certain actions, whether through Sham or others. The desire of the US government to be rid of Sukarno, a leader of the non-aligned and anti-imperialist movements of the Third World, and a protector of the PKI, did not diminish with the failure of the agency-backed military uprising in 1958. Amongst the various reports of the early 1960s indicating a continuing interest in this end, a CIA memorandum of June 1962 is strikingly to the point. The author of the memo, whose name is deleted, was reporting on the impressions he had received from conversations with Western diplomats concerning a recent meeting between President Kennedy and British Prime Minister Macmillan. The 2 leaders agreed, said the memo, to attempt to isolate Sukarno in Asia and Africa. Further, they agreed to liquidate President Sukarno, depending upon the situation and available opportunities. It is not clear to me, the CIA officer, whether murder or overthrow is intended by the word liquidate. Whatever was intended, Sukarno was now, for all practical purposes, eliminated as an international thorn in the flesh. Of even greater significance, the PKI, which had been the largest communist party in the world outside the Soviet bloc and China, had been decimated, its tattered remnants driven underground. It could not have worked out better for the United States and the new military junta if it had been planned. If the generals had been planning their own coup as alleged, the evidence is compelling that the United States was intimately involved before, during and after the events of 30 September/1 October. One aspect of this evidence is the closeness of the relationship between the American and Indonesian military establishments which the United States had been cultivating for many years. President Kennedy, his former aide Arthur Schlesinger has written, was anxious to strengthen the anti-communist forces, especially the army, in order to make sure that, if anything happened to Sukarno, the powerful Indonesian Communist Party would not inherit the country. Roger Hilsman, whose career spanned the CIA and the State Department, has noted that by 1963, 1/3 of the Indonesian General Staff had had some sort of training from Americans and almost half of the officer corps. As a result of both the Civic Action Project and the training program, the American and Indonesian military had come to know each other rather well. Bonds of personal respect and even affection existed. This observation is reinforced by reports of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. At the time of the attempted communist coup and military counter-coup of October 1965, more than 1,200 Indonesian officers, including senior military figures, had been trained in the United States. As a result of this experience, numerous friendships and contacts existed between the Indonesian and American military establishments, particularly between members of the two armies. In the post-coup period, when the political situation was still unsettled, the United States, using these existing channels of communication, was able to provide the anti-communist forces with moral and token material support. When the average MAP military assistance program trainee returns home, he may well have some American acquaintances and a fair appreciation of the United States. This impact may provide some valuable future opportunity for communication as occurred in Indonesia during and immediately after the attempted communist-backed coup of October 1965. The CIA, wrote the New York Times, was said to have been so successful at infiltrating the top of the Indonesian government and army that the United States was reluctant to disrupt CIA covering operations by withdrawing aid and information programs in 1964 and 1965. What was presented officially in Washington as toleration of President Sukarno's insults and provocations was in much larger measure a desire to keep the CIA fronts in business as long as possible. Finally, we have the testimony of Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara before a Senate committee in 1966. Senator Sparkman, at a time when Indonesia was kicking up pretty badly, when we were getting a lot of criticism for continuing military aid, at that time we could not say what that military aid was for. Is it secret anymore? McNamara, I think in retrospect that the aid was well justified. Sparkman, you think it paid dividends? McNamara, I do, sir. There are other statements which may be pertinent to the question of American involvement. Former U.S. Ambassador Marshall Green, speaking in Australia in 1973, where he was then ambassador, is reported as saying, "In 1965, I remember, Indonesia was poised at the razor's edge. I remember people arguing from here that Indonesia wouldn't go communist. But when Sukarno announced in his August 17th speech that Indonesia would have a communist government within a year, then I was almost certain. What we did we had to do, and you'd better be glad we did, because if we hadn't, Asia would be a different place today." James Reston, writing in the New York Times in 1966, Washington is being careful not to claim any credit for this change from Sukarno to Suharto. But this does not mean that Washington had nothing to do with it. There was a great deal more contact between the anti-communist forces in that country and at least one very high official in Washington before and during the Indonesian massacre than is generally realized. General Suharto's forces, at times severely short of food and munitions, have been getting aid from here through various third countries, and it is doubtful if the Suharto coup would ever have been attempted without the American show of strength in Vietnam or been sustained without the clandestine aid it has received indirectly from here. Neville Maxwell, Senior Research Officer, Institute of Commonwealth Studies, Oxford University. A few years ago, I was researching in Pakistan into the diplomatic background of the 1965 Indo-Pakistan conflict, and in foreign ministry papers to which I had been given access came across a letter to the then foreign minister, Mr. Bhutto, from one of his ambassadors in Europe, I believe Mr. J. A. Rahim, in Paris, reporting a conversation with a Dutch intelligence officer with NATO. According to my note of that letter, the officer had remarked to the Pakistani diplomat that Indonesia was ready to fall into the Western lap like a rotten apple. Western intelligence agencies, he said, would organize a premature communist coup. which would be foredoomed to fail, providing a legitimate and welcome opportunity to the army to crush the communists and make Sukarno a prisoner of the army's goodwill. The ambassador's report was dated December 1964. It should be remembered that Indonesia had been a colony of the Netherlands, and the Dutch still had some special links to the country. The record of the new order imposed by General Suharto upon the people of Indonesia for almost 3 decades has been remarkable. The government administers the nation on the level of Chicago gangsters of the 1930s running a protection racket. Political prisoners overflow the jails. Torture is routine. Death squads roam at will, killing not only subversives, but suspected criminals by the thousands. An army officer in the province of Aceh fires a single shot in the air, at which point all young males must run to a central square before the soldier fires a second shot. Then, anyone arriving late or not leaving his home is shot on the spot, and 200,000 more. In 1975, Indonesia invaded the former Portuguese colony of East Timor, which lies at the eastern end of the Indonesian archipelago and which had proclaimed its independence after Portugal relinquished control. It was the beginning of a massacre that continues into the 1990s. By 1989, Amnesty International estimated that Indonesian troops, with the aim of forcibly annexing East Timor, had killed 200,000 people out of a population of between 600,000 and 700,000. The level of atrocity has often been on a par with that carried out against the PKI in Indonesia itself. The invasion of December 7, 1975, of which, said the New York Times, by any definition, Indonesia is guilty of naked aggression, was launched the day after U.S. President Gerald Ford and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger left Indonesia following a meeting with President Suharto. Columnist Jack Anderson later reported, by December 3, 1975, an intelligence dispatch to Washington reported that ranking Indonesian civilian government leaders have decided that the only solution in the Portuguese Timor situation is for Indonesia to launch an open offensive against Fretilin, the leading East Timorese resistance movement. But it was essential to neutralize the United States, for the Indonesian army relied heavily on U.S. arms, which, under our laws, could not be used for aggression. As it happened, President Gerald Ford was on his way to Indonesia for a state visit. An intelligence report forewarned that Suharto would bring up the Timor issue and would try and elicit a sympathetic attitude. That Suharto succeeded is confirmed by Ford himself. The United States had suffered a devastating setback in Vietnam, leaving Indonesia as the most important American ally in the area. The U.S. national interest, Ford concluded, had to be on the side of Indonesia. Ford gave his tacit approval on December 6, 1975. 5 days after the invasion, the United Nations voted to condemn the attack as an errant act of international aggression. The United States abstained. Thereafter, the U.S. delegate maneuvered behind the scenes to resist UN moves aimed at forcing Indonesia to give up its conquest. Throughout the late 1970s and the 1980s, U.S. State Department officials, in statements to the press and in testimony before Congress, consistently supported Indonesia's claim to East Timor, unlike the United Nations and the European community, and downplayed the slaughter to a remarkable extent. Meanwhile, the omnipresent American military advisors, the training, the weapons, the helicopter gunships, and all the other instruments indispensable to efficient, modern counterinsurgency warfare were kept flowing into the hands of the Indonesian military. This may not be all, for Fretilin reported on a number of occasions that American advisors were directing and even participating in the combat.
32. Ghana 1966.
Kwame Nkrumah steps out of line. In October of the year 1965, Kwame Nkrumah, the president of Ghana, published his famous-to-be book, Neo-Colonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, dedicated to the freedom fighters of Africa, living and dead. In the book, Nkrumah accused the CIA of being behind numerous setbacks and crises in the Third World and Eastern Europe. He later wrote that, "The American government sent me a note of protest and promptly refused Ghana $35 million of aid." For months later, he was overthrown in a CIA-backed military coup. To be sure, the coup makers, members of the Ghanaian army and police, had their own motivations. They were fearful of having their powers stripped from them by a suspicious Nkrumah who was building up his own private army, and they were intent upon furthering their individual professional careers and status. Within days, even hours, of the successful coup in February 1966, majors had become colonels and colonels had become generals. There was more than a touch of the Keystone Cops to the whole episode. Kwame Nkrumah was a man who, as a student in the United States during the Great Depression, had roamed Harlem, slept in the subway, and lined up at Father Divine's soup kitchens. Later, he was to be hailed as Africa's brightest star, a leader in the call for an anti-imperialist, Pan-African organization and an international movement of nations non-aligned in the Cold War. But from all accounts, Nkrumah engaged in idiosyncratic one-man rule and thought that socialism could be promoted by edict from above. And though he spoke out boldly against neocolonialism, he was unable, ultimately, to keep Ghana from falling under the sway of the multinationals. When he attempted to lessen his country's dependence on the West by strengthening economic and military ties to the Soviet Union, China, and East Germany, he effectively sealed his fate. The United States wanted him out. Great Britain, the former colonial power in Ghana when it was known as the Gold Coast, wanted him out. France and West Germany wanted him out. Those Ghanaians who carried out the coup suffered from no doubts that a move against Nkrumah would be supported by the Western powers. At the time of the coup, the Soviet press charged that the CIA had been involved, and in 1972 the Daily Telegraph, the conservative London newspaper, reported that by 1965 the Accra, capital of Ghana's CIA station, had 20 active operators, distributing largesse among President Nkrumah's secret adversaries. By February 1966, the report continued, the CIA had its plans ready to end Nkrumah's regime. The patient and assiduous work of the Accra CIA station was fully rewarded. It wasn't until 1978, however, that the story broke in the United States. Former CIA officer John Stockwell, who had spent most of his career in Africa, published a book in which he revealed the agency's complicity. Shortly afterwards, the New York Times, quoting first-hand intelligence sources, corroborated that the CIA had advised and supported the dissident Ghanaian army officers. Stockwell disclosed that the CIA station in Accra was given a generous budget and maintained intimate contact with the plotters as a coup was hatched. So close was the station's involvement that it was able to coordinate the recovery of some classified Soviet military equipment by the United States as the coup took place. The CIA station had also proposed to headquarters in Washington that a small squad of paramilitary experts, members of the agency's Special Operations Group, be on hand at the moment of the coup, with their faces blacked, storm the Chinese embassy, kill everyone inside, steal their secret records, and blow up the building to cover the fact. This proposal was squashed, Stockwell wrote, but inside CIA headquarters the Accra station was given full, if unofficial credit for the eventual coup, in which 8 Soviet advisors were killed. The Soviet Union categorically denied that any of its advisors had been killed. Other intelligence sources who were in Ghana at the time of the coup have taken issue with Stockwell's view that the CIA deserved full credit for Nkrumah's downfall, but they considered the agency's role to have been pivotal, and at least some officials in Washington apparently agreed, for the CIA station chief in Accra, Howard T. Bain, was quickly promoted to a senior position in the agency. When he was successful, one of the New York Times sources said of Bain, everyone in the African division knew it. If it had failed, he would have been transferred and no CIA involvement revealed. Bain, nevertheless, was enraged by the CIA's high-level decision not to permit the raid on the Chinese embassy. At the time, the Peking government's only embassy in Africa. They didn't have the guts to do it, he subsequently told an associate. After the coup, the CIA made a payment of at least $100,000 to the new Ghanaian regime for the confiscated Soviet material, one item of which was a cigarette lighter that also functioned as a camera. The Ghanaian leaders soon expelled large numbers of Russians as well as Chinese and East Germans. Virtually all state-owned industries were allowed to pass into private hands. In short order, the channels of aid previously clogged opened wide, and credit, food, and development projects flowed in from the United States, the European powers, and the International Monetary Fund. Washington, for example, 3 weeks after the coup, approved substantial emergency food assistance in response to an urgent request from Ghana. A food request from Nkrumah 4 months earlier had been turned down. 1 month after his ouster, the international price of cocoa, Ghana's economic lifeblood, had risen 14%. The CIA's reluctance to approve the action at the Chinese embassy may have stemmed from the fact that the National Security Council had specifically refused to authorize the agency's involvement in the coup at all. This was, as we have seen, not the first instance of the CIA taking American foreign policy into its own hands. On such occasions, the modus operandi calls for putting as little into writing as feasible, or keeping records out of official CIA files, thus making them immune to freedom of information disclosures or congressional investigations. Technically, the records do not exist. Legally, they can be destroyed at any time. This was the case with the Ghanaian coup and may explain why more details of the CIA role have never been revealed. The American right-wing view of what happened. According to John Barron, the Reader's Digest's resident KGB expert, Nkrumah was overthrown by only native insurgents, the only foreigners in the picture being 11 KGB officers who were found in Nkrumah's headquarters and summarily executed. The Soviet Union didn't say a word about this, he wrote, because they didn't want the world to know that KGB officers were actually sitting in the Ghanaian president's office running the country. Barron offers no evidence at all to support his claim of the KGB running the country, nor does he explain why the new government didn't publicize this very interesting fact. He goes on to write of the copious secret files of the Nkrumah regime, which were discovered and then studied and analyzed. The files revealed, he says, that the KGB had converted Ghana into one vast base of subversion, which the Soviet Union fully intended to use to capture the continent of Africa. For reasons best known to himself perhaps, Barron fails to offer the reader a single quotation from any of the copious secret files to support his allegations.
33 Uruguay 1964 a 1970.
Torture as American as apple pie. The precise pain in the precise place, in the precise amount, for the desired effect. The words of an instructor in the art of torture. The words of Dan Mitrione, the head of the Office of Public Safety, OPS, mission in Montevideo. Officially, OPS was a division of the Agency for International Development, but the director of OPS in Washington, Byron Engel, was an old CIA hand. His organization maintained a close working relationship with the CIA, and agency officers often operated abroad under OPS cover, although Mitrione was not one of them. OPS had been operating formally in Uruguay since 1965, supplying the police with the equipment, the arms, and the training it was created to do. For years later, when Mitrione arrived, the Uruguayans had a special need for OPS services. The country was in the midst of a long-running economic decline, its once heralded prosperity and democracy sinking fast toward the level of its South American neighbors. Labor strikes, student demonstrations, and militant street violence had become normal events during the past year. And, most worrisome to the Uruguayan authorities, there were the revolutionaries who called themselves Tupamaros. Perhaps the cleverest, most resourceful, and most sophisticated urban guerrillas the world has ever seen, the Tupamaros had a deft touch for capturing the public's imagination with outrageous actions and winning sympathizers with their Robin Hood philosophy. Their members and secret partisans held key positions in the government, banks, universities, and the professions, as well as in the military and police. Unlike other Latin American guerrilla groups, the New York Times stated in 1970, the Tupamaros normally avoid bloodshed when possible. They try instead to create embarrassment for the government and general disorder. A favorite tactic was to raid the files of a private corporation to expose corruption and deceit in high places, or kidnap a prominent figure and try him before a people's court. It was heady stuff to choose a public villain whose acts went uncensored by the legislature, the courts, and the press, subject him to an informed and uncompromising interrogation, and then publicize the results of the intriguing dialogue. Once they ransacked an exclusive high-class nightclub and scrawled on the walls perhaps their most memorable slogan, "O bailan todos, o no baila nadia," either everyone dances or no one dances. Dan Mitrione did not introduce the practice of torturing political prisoners to Uruguay. It had been perpetrated by the police at times from at least the early 1960s. However, in a surprising interview given to a leading Brazilian newspaper in 1970, the former Uruguayan chief of police intelligence, Alejandro Otero, declared that U.S. advisors, and in particular Mitrione, had instituted torture as a more routine measure. To the means of inflicting pain, they had added scientific refinement, and to that a psychology to create despair, such as playing a tape in the next room of women and children screaming and telling the prisoner that it was his family being tortured. The violent methods which were beginning to be employed, said Otero, caused an escalation in Tupamaro activity. Before then, their attitude showed that they would use violence only as a last resort. The newspaper interview greatly upset American officials in South America and Washington. Byron Engel later tried to explain it all away by asserting, "The 3 Brazilian reporters in Montevideo all denied filing that story. We found out later that it was slipped into the paper by someone in the composing room at the Jornal do Brasil." Otero had been a willing agent of the CIA, a student at their International Police Services School in Washington, a recipient of their cash over the years, but he was not a torturer. What finally drove him to speak out was perhaps the torture of a woman who, while a Tupamaro sympathizer, was also a friend of his. When she told him that Mitrione had watched and assisted in her torture, Otero complained to him about this particular incident as well as his general methods of extracting information. The only outcome of the encounter was Otero's demotion. William Cantrell was a CIA operations officer stationed in Montevideo, ostensibly as a member of the OPS team. In the mid-1960s, he was instrumental in setting up a Department of Information and Intelligence, D2, and providing it with funds and equipment. Some of the equipment, innovated by the CIA's Technical Services Division, was for the purpose of torture, for this was one of the functions carried out by the D2. One of the pieces of equipment that was found useful, former New York Times correspondent A.J. Langeth learned, was a wire so very thin that it could be fitted into the mouth between the teeth and by pressing against the gum increase the electrical charge. And it was through the diplomatic pouch that Mitrione got some of the equipment he needed for interrogations, including these fine wires. Things got so bad in Mitrione's time that the Uruguayan Senate was compelled to undertake an investigation. After a 5-month study, the commission concluded unanimously that torture in Uruguay had become a normal, frequent, and habitual occurrence, inflicted upon Tupamaros as well as others. Among the types of torture the commission's report made reference to were electric shocks to the genitals, electric needles under the fingernails, burning with cigarettes, the slow compression of the testicles, daily use of psychological torture. Pregnant women were subjected to various brutalities and inhuman treatment. Certain women were imprisoned with their very young infants and subjected to the same treatment. Eventually, the D2 came to serve as a cover for the Escuadrón de la Muerte, Death Squad, composed, as elsewhere in Latin America, primarily of police officers, who bombed and strafed the homes of suspected Tupamaro sympathizers and engaged in assassination and kidnapping. The Death Squad received some of its special explosive material from the Technical Services Division and, in all likelihood, some of the skills employed by its members were acquired from instruction in the United States. Between 1969 and 1973, at least 16 Uruguayan police officers went through an 8-week course at CIA/OPS schools in Washington and Los Fresnos, Texas in the design, manufacture, and employment of bombs and incendiary devices. The official OPS explanation for these courses was that policemen needed such training in order to deal with bombs placed by terrorists. There was, however, no instruction in destroying bombs, only in making them. Moreover, on at least one reported occasion, the students were not policemen, but members of a private right-wing organization in Chile, see chapter on Chile. Another part of the curriculum which might also have proven to be of value to the Death Squad was the class on assassination weapons. A discussion of various weapons which may be used by the assassin is how OPS put it. Equipment and training of this kind was in addition to that normally provided by OPS. Riot helmets, transparent shields, tear gas, gas masks, communication gear, vehicles, police batons, and other devices for restraining crowds. The supply of these tools of the trade was increased in 1968 when public disturbances reached the spark point, and by 1970 American training in riot control techniques had been given to about 1,000 Uruguayan policemen. Dan Mitrione had built a soundproofed room in the cellar of his house in Montevideo. In this room, he assembled selected Uruguayan police officers to observe a demonstration of torture techniques. Another observer was Manuel Javier Cosculluela, a Cuban who was with the CIA and worked with Mitrione. Hevia later wrote that the course began with a description of the human anatomy and nervous system. Soon things turned unpleasant. As subjects for the first testing, they took beggars, known in Uruguay as bichicomes, from the outskirts of Montevideo, as well as a woman apparently from the frontier area with Brazil. There was no interrogation, only a demonstration of the effects of different voltages on the different parts of the human body, as well as demonstrating the use of a drug which induces vomiting, I don't know why or what for, and another chemical substance. The 4 of them died. In his book, Hevia does not say specifically what Mitrione's direct part in all this was, but he later publicly stated that the OPS chief personally tortured 4 beggars to death with electric shocks. On another occasion, Hevia sat with Mitrione in the latter's house, and over a few drinks the American explained to the Cuban his philosophy of interrogation. Mitrione considered it to be an art. First, there should be a softening up period, with the usual beatings and insults. The object is to humiliate the prisoner, to make him realize his helplessness, to cut him off from reality. No questions, only blows and insults. Then only blows in silence. Only after this, said Mitrione, is the interrogation. Here no pain should be produced other than that caused by the instrument which is being used. The precise pain in the precise place, in the precise amount, for the desired effect, was his motto. During the session you have to keep the subject from losing all hope of life because this can lead to stubborn resistance. You must always leave him some hope, a distant light. When you get what you want, and I always get it, Mitrione continued, it may be good to prolong the session a little to apply another softening up, not to extract information now, but only as a political measure, to create a healthy fear of meddling in subversive activities. The American pointed out that upon receiving a subject, the first thing is to determine his physical state, his degree of resistance by means of a medical examination. A premature death means a failure by the technician. It's important to know in advance if we can permit ourselves the luxury of the subject's death. Not long after this conversation, Manuel Hevia disappeared from Montevideo and turned up in Havana. He had been a Cuban agent, a double agent, all along. About half a year later, July 31st, 1970 to be exact, Dan Mitrione was kidnapped by the Tupamaros. They did not torture him. They demanded the release of some 150 prisoners in exchange for him. With the determined backing of the Nixon administration, the Uruguayan government refused. On August 10th, Mitrione's dead body was found on the back seat of a stolen car. He had turned 50 on his 5th day as a prisoner. Back in Mitrione's hometown of Richmond, Indiana, Secretary of State William Rogers and President Nixon's son-in-law David Eisenhower attended the funeral for Mitrione, the city's former police chief. Frank Sinatra and Jerry Lewis came to town to stage a benefit show for Mitrione's family, and White House spokesman Ron Ziegler solemnly stated that Mr. Mitrione's devoted service to the cause of peaceful progress in an orderly world will remain as an example for free men everywhere. A perfect man, his widow said. A great humanitarian, said his daughter Linda. The military's entry into the escalating conflict signaled the beginning of the end for the Tupamaros. By the end of 1972, the curtain was descending on their guerrilla theater. 6 months later, the military was in charge, Congress was dissolved, and everything not prohibited was compulsory. For the next 11 years, Uruguay competed strongly for the honor of being South America's most repressive dictatorship. It had, at one point, the largest number of political prisoners per capita in the world. And, as every human rights organization and former prisoner could testify, each one of them was tortured. Torture, said an activist priest, was routine and automatic. No one was dancing in Uruguay. In 1981, at the 14th Conference of American Armies, the Uruguayan Army offered a paper in which it defined subversion as actions, violent or not, with ultimate purposes of a political nature, in all fields of human activity within the internal sphere of a state and whose aims are perceived as not convenient for the overall political system. The dissident Uruguayan writer, Eduardo Galeano, summed up his country's era of dictatorship thusly: people were in prison so that prices could be free. The film State of Siege appeared in 1972. It centered around Mitrione and the Tupamaros and depicted a Uruguayan police officer receiving training at a secret bomb school in the United States. though the film strove more to provide a composite picture of the role played by the U.S. in repression throughout Latin America. A scheduled premiere showing of the film at the federally funded John F. Kennedy Arts Center in Washington was canceled. There was already growing public and congressional criticism of this dark side of American foreign policy without adding to it. During the mid-1970s, however, Congress enacted several pieces of legislation which abolished the entire public safety program. In its time, OPS had provided training for more than 1 million policemen in the Third World. 10,000 of them had received advanced training in the United States. An estimated $150 million worth of equipment had been shipped to police forces abroad. Now, the export of repression was to cease. That was on paper. The reality appears to be somewhat different. To a large extent, the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, simply picked up where OPS had left off. The drug agency was ideally suited for the task, for its agents were already deployed all over Latin America and elsewhere overseas in routine liaison with foreign police forces. The DEA acknowledged in 1975 that 53 former employees of the CIA were now on its staff and that there was a close working relationship between the two agencies. The following year, the General Accounting Office reported that DEA agents were engaging in many of the same activities the OPS had been carrying out. In addition, some training of foreign policemen was transferred to FBI schools in Washington and Quantico, Virginia. The Defense Department continued to supply police-type equipment to military units engaged in internal security operations, and American arms manufacturers were doing a booming business furnishing arms and training to third world governments. In some countries, contact between these companies and foreign law enforcement officials was facilitated by the U.S. Embassy or military mission. The largest of the arms manufacturers, Smith & Wesson, ran its own academy in Springfield, Massachusetts, which provided American and foreign public and industrial security forces with expert training in riot control. Said Argentine Minister Jose Lopez Riga at the signing of a U.S.-Argentina anti-drug treaty in 1974. "We hope to wipe out the drug traffic in Argentina. We have caught guerrillas after attacks who were high on drugs. The guerrillas are the main drug users in Argentina. Therefore, this anti-drug campaign will automatically be an anti-guerrilla campaign as well." And in 1981, a former Uruguayan intelligence officer declared that U.S. manuals were being used to teach techniques of torture to his country's military. He said that most of the officers who trained him had attended classes run by the United States in Panama. Among other niceties, the manuals listed 35 nerve points where electrodes could be applied. Philip Agee, after he left Ecuador, was stationed in Uruguay from March 1964 to August 1966. His account of CIA activities in Montevideo is further testimony to the amount of international mischief money can buy. Amongst the multifarious dirty tricks pulled off with impunity by Agee and his agency cohorts, the following constitute an interesting sample. A Latin American students' conference with a leftist leaning, held in Montevideo, was undermined by promoting the falsehood that it was nothing more than a creature of the Soviet Union, originated, financed, and directed by Moscow. Editorials on this theme authored by the CIA appeared in leading newspapers to which the agency had daily access. This was followed by publication of a forged letter of a student leader thanking the Soviet cultural attaché for his assistance. A banner headline in one paper proclaimed, "Documents for the break with Russia," which was indeed the primary purpose of the operation. An inordinate amount of time, energy, and creativity was devoted, with moderate success, to schemes aimed at encouraging the expulsion of an assortment of Russians, East Germans, North Koreans, Czechs, and Cubans from Uruguayan soil, if not the breaking of relations with these countries. In addition to planting disparaging media propaganda, the CIA tried to obtain incriminating information by reading the mail and diplomatic cables to and from these countries, tapping embassy phones, and engaging in sundry bugging and surreptitious entry. The agency would then prepare intelligence reports, containing enough factual information to be plausible, which then made their way innocently into the hands of officials of influence, up to and including the President of the Republic. Anti-communist indoctrination of secondary-level students was promoted by financing particular school organizations and publications. A Congress of the People, bringing together a host of community groups, labor organizations, students, government workers, etc., communist and non-communist, disturbed the CIA because of the potential for a united front being formed for electoral purposes. Accordingly, newspaper editorials and articles were generated attacking the Congress as a classic communist takeover/duping tactic and calling upon non-communists to refrain from participating. And a phony handbill was circulated in which the Congress called upon the Uruguayan people to launch an insurrectional strike with immediate occupation of their places of work. Thousands of the handbills were handed out, provoking angry denials from the Congress organizers. But as is usual in such cases, the damage was already done. The Uruguayan Communist Party planned to host an international conference to express solidarity with Cuba. The CIA merely had to turn to their paid friend, the Minister of the Interior, and the conference was banned. When it was shifted to Chile, the CIA station in Santiago performed the same magic. Uruguay at this time was a haven for political exiles from repressive regimes such as in Brazil, Argentina, Bolivia, and Paraguay. The CIA, through surveillance and infiltration of the exile community, regularly collected information on exiles' activities, associates, etc., to be sent to CIA stations in the exiles' homelands with likely transmission to their governments, which wanted to know what these troublemakers were up to and which did not hesitate to harass them across frontiers. Other operations, wrote AG, were designed to take control of the streets away from communists and other leftists, and our squads, often with the participation of off-duty policemen, would break up their meetings and generally terrorize them. Torture of communists and other extreme leftists was used in interrogation by our liaison agents in the police. The monitoring and harassment of communist diplomatic missions by the CIA, as described above, was standard agency practice throughout the world. This rarely stemmed from anything more than a juvenile Cold War reflex, making life hard for the commies. Postscript: in 1998, Ilidio Mal, a retired Uruguayan Navy Rear Admiral and former intelligence chief, testifying before a commission of the Uruguayan Chamber of Deputies, stated that during Uruguay's Dirty War, 1972 to 1983, orders came from the United States to kill captive members of the Tupamaros after interrogating them. The guidance that was sent from the US, said Mal, was that what had to be done with the captured guerrillas was to get information, and that afterwards they didn't deserve to live.
34 Chile 1964 a 1973.
A hammer and sickle stamped on your child's forehead. When Salvador Allende, a committed Marxist, came within 3% of winning the Chilean presidency in 1958, the United States decided that the next election in 1964 could not be left in the hands of Providence or democracy. Washington took it all very gravely. At the outset of the Kennedy administration in 1961, an electoral committee was established, composed of top-level officials from the State Department, the CIA, and the White House. In Santiago, a parallel committee of embassy and CIA people was set up. U.S. government intervention in Chile in 1964 was blatant and almost obscene, said one intelligence officer strategically placed at the time. We were shipping people off right and left, mainly State Department but also CIA, with all sorts of covers. All in all, as many as 100 American operatives were dedicated to the operation. They began laying the groundwork for the election years ahead, a Senate investigating committee has disclosed, by establishing operational relationships with key political parties and by creating propaganda and organizational mechanisms capable of influencing key sectors of the population. Projects were undertaken to help train and organize anti-communists among peasants, slum dwellers, organized labor, students, the media, etc. After channeling funds to several non-leftist parties, the electoral team eventually settled on a man of the center, Eduardo Frei, the candidate of the Christian Democratic Party, as the one most likely to block Allende's rise to power. The CIA underwrote more than half the party's total campaign costs. One of the reasons that the agency's overall electoral operation reduced the U.S. Treasury by an estimated $20 million, much more per voter than that spent by the Johnson and Goldwater campaigns combined in the same year in the United States. The bulk of the expenditures went toward propaganda. As the Senate committee described it, in addition to support for political parties, the CIA mounted a massive anti-communist propaganda campaign. Extensive use was made of the press, radio, films, pamphlets, posters, leaflets, direct mailings, paper streamers, and wall painting. It was a scare campaign, which relied heavily on images of Soviet tanks and Cuban firing squads, and was directed especially to women. Hundreds of thousands of copies of the anti-communist pastoral letter of Pope Pius XI were distributed by Christian democratic organizations. They carried the designation, printed privately by citizens without political affiliation, in order more broadly to disseminate its content. Disinformation and black propaganda, material which purported to originate from another source, such as the Chilean Communist Party, were used as well. The scare campaign played up to the fact that women in Chile, as elsewhere in Latin America, are traditionally more religious than men, more susceptible to being alarmed by the specter of godless, atheist communism. One radio spot featured the sound of a machine gun, followed by a woman's cry, "They have killed my child, the communists." The announcer then added in impassioned tones, "Communism offers only blood and pain. For this not to happen in Chile, we must elect Eduardo Free president." Other scare tactics centered around warnings of Russian control, and that the left would confiscate everything near, dear, and holy. The committee report continued, "The propaganda campaign was enormous. During the first week of intensive propaganda activity, the third week of June 1964, a CIA-funded propaganda group produced 20 radio spots per day in Santiago and on 44 provincial stations. 12-minute news broadcasts 5 times daily on 3 Santiago stations and 24 provincial outlets. Thousands of cartoons, and much paid press advertising. By the end of June, the group produced 24 daily newscasts in Santiago and the provinces, 26 weekly commentary programs, and distributed 3,000 posters daily. One poster which appeared in the thousands showed children with a hammer and sickle stamped on their foreheads. Newspaper articles from elsewhere in Latin America which supported the political lines of the CIA campaign were collected and reprinted in Chile. Undoubtedly, many of these articles had been written in the first place by CIA stations in the particular countries. There were also endorsements of free solicited from famous personages abroad, advertisements such as a message from the women of Venezuela, and a vitriolic anti-communist radio broadcast by Juanita Castro, sister of Fidel, who was on a CIA-organized speaking tour of South America. "If the Reds win in Chile," she said, "no type of religious activity will be possible. Chilean mother, I know you will not allow your children to be taken from you and sent to the communist bloc, as in the case of Cuba." The Senate committee also revealed that, in addition to buying propaganda piecemeal, the CIA station often purchased it wholesale by subsidizing Chilean media organizations friendly to the United States. Doing so was propaganda writ large. Instead of placing individual items, the CIA supported, or even founded, friendly media outlets which might not have existed in the absence of agency support. From 1953 through 1970 in Chile, the station subsidized wire services, magazines written for intellectual circles, and a right-wing weekly newspaper. Of one subsidized newspaper, a State Department veteran of the campaign recalls that the layout was magnificent. The photographs were superb. It was a Madison Avenue product far above the standards of Chilean publications. The same could be said about the electioneering itself. Besides running political action projects on its own in a number of important voting blocks, the CIA directed the Christian Democrats campaign along American-style lines, with voter registration, get-out-the-vote drives, and professional management firms to carry out public opinion surveys. To top it all off, they sent for a ringer, an election specialist from the staff of that eminent connoisseur and guardian of free elections, Mayor Richard Daley of Chicago. What the function of Daley's man in Chile was can only be guessed at. Several of the grassroots programs funded by the CIA were those run by Roger Viekmans, a Belgian Jesuit priest who arrived in Chile in 1957 and founded a network of social action organizations, one of which grew to have 100 employees and a $30 million annual budget. By his own declaration in 1963, Viekmans received $5 million from the CIA, as well as a like amount from aid to guide his organization's resources in support of the Christian Democrats and Eduardo Free, with whom Viekmans had close relations. The Jesuits' programs served the classic function of channeling revolutionary zeal along safe reformist paths. Church people working for the CIA in the Third World have typically been involved in gathering information about the activities and attitudes of individual peasants and workers, spotting the troublemakers, recruiting likely agents, preaching the gospel of anti-communism, acting as funding conduits, and serving as a religious cover for various agency operations. An extreme anti-communist, Viekmans was a frontline soldier in the struggle of the Christian Democrats and the Catholic Church against the liberation theology. The operation worked. It worked beyond expectations. Free received 56% of the vote to Allende's 39%. The CIA regarded the anti-communist scare campaign as the most effective activity undertaken, noted the Senate committee. This was the tactic directed toward Chilean women in particular. As things turned out, Allende won the men's vote by 67,000 over Free. In Chile, men and women vote separately. But amongst the women, Free came out ahead by 469,000 testimony. Once again, to the remarkable ease with which the minds of the masses of people can be manipulated in any and all societies. What was there about Salvador Allende that warranted all this feverish activity? What threat did he represent? This man against whom the great technical and economic resources of the world's most powerful nation were brought to bear. Allende was a man whose political program, as described by the Senate committee report, was to redistribute income. 2% of the population received 46% of the income, and reshape the Chilean economy, beginning with the nationalization of major industries, especially the copper companies, greatly expanded agrarian reform, and expanded relations with socialist and communist countries. A man committed to such a program could be expected by American policymakers to lead his country along a path independent of the priorities of U.S. foreign policy and the multinationals. As his later term as president confirmed, he was independent of any other country as well. The CIA is an ongoing organization. Its covert activities are ongoing each day in each country. Between the 1964 and 1970 presidential elections, many of the programs designed to foster an anti-leftist mentality in different sections of the population continued. Much of the propaganda and electioneering mechanisms remained in place to support candidates of the 1965 and 1969 congressional elections. In the latter election, financial support was given to a splinter socialist party in order to attract votes away from Allende's Socialist Party. This reportedly deprived the party of a minimum of 7 congressional seats. The Senate committee described some of the other individual covert projects undertaken by the CIA during this period. Wresting control of Chilean university student organizations from the communists. Supporting a women's group active in Chilean political and intellectual life. To combating the communist-dominated Central Única de Trabajadores Chilenos, CUTCH, and supporting democratic, i.e., anti-communist labor groups, and exploiting a civic action front group to combat communist influence within cultural and intellectual circles. In 1968, at the same time the CIA was occupied in subverting unions dominated by the Chilean Communist Party, a U.S. Senate committee was concluding that the Latin American labor movement had largely abandoned its revolutionary outlook. Even the communist-dominated unions, especially those which follow the Moscow Line, now generally accept the peaceful road as a viable alternative. I don't see why we need to stand by and watch a country go communist because of the irresponsibility of its own people. Thus spoke Henry Kissinger, principal advisor to the President of the United States on matters of national security. The date was June 27, 1970, a meeting of the National Security Council's 40 Committee, and the people Kissinger suspected of imminent irresponsibility were the Chileans whom he feared might finally elect Salvador Allende as their president. The United States did not stand by idly. At this meeting, approval was given to a $300,000 increase in the anti-Allende spoiling operation which was already underway. The CIA trained its disinformation-heavy artillery on the Chilean electorate, firing shells marked, "An Allende victory means violence and Stalinist repression." Black propaganda was employed to undermine Allende's coalition and support by sowing dissent between the Communist Party and the Socialist Party, the main members of the coalition, and between the Communist Party and the CUTCH. Nonetheless, on September 4th, Allende won a plurality of the votes. On October 24th, the Chilean Congress would meet to choose between him and the runner-up Jorge Alessandri of the Conservative National Party. By tradition, Allende was certain to become president. The United States had 7 weeks to prevent him from taking office. On September 15th, President Nixon met with Kissinger, CIA Director Richard Helms, and Attorney General John Mitchell. Helms' handwritten notes of the meeting have become famous. 1 in 10 chance perhaps, but save Chile, not concerned with risks involved. $10, 000, 000 available. More if necessary. Make the economy scream. Funds were authorized by the 40 Committee to bribe Chilean congressmen to vote for Alessandri. But this was soon abandoned as infeasible, and under intense pressure from Richard Nixon, American efforts were concentrated on inducing the Chilean military to stage a coup and then cancel the congressional vote altogether. At the same time, Nixon and Kissinger made it clear to the CIA that an assassination of Allende would not be unwelcome. One White House options paper discussed various ways this could be carried out. A fresh propaganda campaign was initiated in Chile to impress upon the military, amongst others, the catastrophe which would befall the nation with Allende as president. In addition to the standard communist horror stories, it was made known that there would be a cutoff of American and other foreign assistance. This was accompanied by predictions/rumors of the nationalization of everything down to small shops, and of economic collapse. The campaign actually affected the Chilean economy adversely, and a major financial panic ensued. In private, Chilean military officers were warned that American military aid would come to a halt if Allende were seated. During this interim period, according to the CIA, over 700 articles, broadcasts, editorials, and similar items were generated in the Latin American and European media as a direct result of agency activity. This is apart from the real media stories inspired by the planted ones. Moreover, journalists in the pay of the CIA arrived in Chile from at least 10 different countries to enhance their material with on-the-spot credibility. The following portion of a CIA cable of September 25, 1970 offers some indication of the scope of such media operations. Sao Paulo, Tegucigalpa, Buenos Aires, Lima, Montevideo, Bogota, Mexico City report continued replay of Chile-themed materials. Items also carried in New York Times and Washington Post. Propaganda activities continue to generate good coverage of Chile developments along our theme guidance. The CIA also gave inside briefings to American journalists about the situation in Chile. One such briefing provided to Time enlightened the magazine as to Allende's intention to support violence and destroy Chile's free press. This, observed the Senate report, resulted in a change in the basic thrust of the Time story. When Allende criticized the leading conservative newspaper El Mercurio, heavily funded by the CIA, the agency orchestrated cables of support and protest from foreign newspapers, a protest statement from an international press association, and world press coverage of the association's protest. A cable sent from CIA headquarters to Santiago on October 19th expressed concern that the coup still had no pretext or justification that it can offer to make it acceptable in Chile or Latin America. It therefore would seem necessary to create one to bolster what will probably be the military's claim to a coup to save Chile from communism. One of headquarters' suggestions was the fabrication of firm intel ligens, that Cubans planned to reorganize all intelligence services along Soviet/Cuban mold, thus creating structure for police state. With appropriate military contact, can determine how to discover intel ligens report, which could even be planted during raids planned by carabineros, the police. Meanwhile, the agency was in active consultation with several Chilean military officers who were receptive to the suggestion of a coup. The difficulty in finding such officers was described by the CIA as a problem in overcoming the apolitical, constitutional-oriented inertia of the Chilean military. They were assured that the United States would give them full support short of direct military involvement. The immediate obstacle faced by the officers was the determined opposition of the Commander-in-Chief of the Army, Rene Schneider, who insisted that the constitutional process be followed. He would have to be removed. In the early morn of October 22nd, the CIA passed sterilized machine guns and ammunition to some of the conspirators. Earlier, they had passed tear gas. That same day, Schneider was mortally wounded in an attempted kidnap on his way to work. The CIA station in Santiago cabled its headquarters that the general had been shot with the same kind of weapons it had delivered to the military plotters, although the agency later claimed to the Senate that the actual assassins were not the same ones it had passed the weapons to. The assassination did not avail the conspirators' purpose. It only served to rally the army around the flag of constitutionalism, and time was running out. 2 days later, Salvador Allende was confirmed by the Chilean Congress. On November 3rd, he took office as president. The stage was set for a clash of two experiments. One was Allende's socialist experiment aimed at lifting Chile from the mire of underdevelopment and dependency and the poor from deprivation. The other was, as CIA Director William Colby later put it, a prototype or laboratory experiment to test the techniques of heavy financial investment in an effort to discredit and bring down a government. Although there were few individual features of this experiment which were unique for the CIA, in sum total it was perhaps the most multifarious intervention ever undertaken by the United States. In the process it brought a new word into the language: destabilization. Not a nut or bolt will be allowed to reach Chile under Allende, warned then American Ambassador Edward Corey before the confirmation. The Chilean economy, so extraordinarily dependent upon the United States, was the country's soft underbelly easy to pound. Over the next 3 years, new U.S. government assistance programs for Chile plummeted almost to the vanishing point. Similarly with loans from the U.S. Export-Import Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, in which the United States held what amounted to a veto, and the World Bank made no new loans at all to Chile during 1971 to 73. U.S. government financial assistance or guarantees to American private investment in Chile were cut back sharply, and American businesses were given the word to tighten the economic noose. What this boycott translated into were things like the many buses and taxis out of commission in Chile due to a lack of replacement parts, and similar difficulties in the copper, steel, electricity, and petroleum industries. American suppliers refused to sell needed parts despite Chile's offer to pay cash in advance. Multinational ITT, which didn't need to be told what to do, stated in a 1970 memorandum, "A more realistic hope among those who want to block Allende is that a swiftly deteriorating economy will touch off a wave of violence leading to a military coup." In the midst of the near disappearance of economic aid, and contrary to its warning, the United States increased its military assistance to Chile during 1972 and 1973, as well as training Chilean military personnel in the United States and Panama. The Allende government, caught between the devil and the deep blue sea, was reluctant to refuse this assistance for fear of antagonizing its military leaders. Perhaps nothing produced more discontent in the population than the shortages, the little daily annoyances when one couldn't get a favorite food or flour or cooking oil or toilet paper, bed sheets or soap, or the one part needed to make the TV set or the car run. Or, worst of all, when a nicotine addict couldn't get a cigarette. Some of the scarcity resulted from Chile being a society in transition, various changeovers to state ownership, experiments in workers' control, etc. But this was minor compared to the effect of the aid squeeze and the practices of the omnipresent American corporations. Equally telling were the extended strikes in Chile, which relied heavily on CIA financial support for their prolongation. In October 1972, for example, an association of private truck owners instituted a work stoppage aimed at disrupting the flow of food and other important commodities, including in their embargo even newspapers which supported the government. Subtlety was not the order of the day in this ultra-polarized country. On the heels of this came store closures, countless petits bourgeois doing their bit to turn the screws of public inconvenience. And when they were open, many held back on certain goods, like cigarettes, to sell them on the black market to those who could afford the higher prices. Then most private bus companies stopped running. On top of this, various professional and white-collar workers, largely unsympathetic to the government, walked out with or without CIA help. Much of this campaign was aimed at wearing down the patience of the public, convincing them that socialism can't work in Chile. Yet there had been worse shortages for most of the people before the Allende government: shortages of food, housing, healthcare, and education, for example. At least half the population had suffered from malnutrition. Allende, who was a medical doctor, explained his free milk program by pointing out that today in Chile there are over 600,000 children mentally retarded because they were not adequately nourished during the first 8 months of their lives, because they did not receive the necessary proteins. Financial aid was not the CIA's only input into the strike scene. More than 100 members of Chilean professional associations and employers' guilds were graduates of the school run by the American Institute for Free Labor Development in Front Royal, Virginia, the Little Anti-Red Schoolhouse. AIFLD, the CIA's principal Latin America labor organization, also assisted in the formation of a new professional association in May 1971, the Confederation of Chilean Professionals. The labor specialists of AIFLD had more than a decade's experience in the art of fomenting economic turmoil, or keeping workers quiescent when the occasion called for it. CIA propaganda merchants had a field day with the disorder and the shortages, exacerbating both by instigating panic buying. All the techniques, the whole of the media saturation, the handy organizations created for each and every purpose, so efficiently employed in 1964 and 1970, were facilitated by the virtually unlimited license granted the press. Headlines and stories which spread rumors about everything from nationalizations to bad meat and undrinkable water. Economic chaos. Chile on brink of doom. In the largest type one could ever expect to see in a newspaper, raising the specter of civil war, when not actually calling for it, literally alarmist stories which anywhere else in the world would have been branded seditious. The worst of London's daily tabloids or the National Enquirer of the United States appear as staid as a journal of dentistry by comparison. In response, on a few occasions, the government briefly closed down a newspaper or magazine, on the left as well as on the right, for endangering security. The agency's routine support of the political opposition was extended to include the extreme rightist organization Patria y Libertad, which the CIA reportedly helped to form, and whose members had trained in guerrilla warfare and bombing techniques at schools in Bolivia and Los Fresnos, Texas. Patria y Libertad marched in rallies in full riot gear, engaged repeatedly in acts of violence and provocation, and its publications openly called for a military coup. The CIA was engaged in courting the military for the same end. Providing military equipment meant the normal presence of U.S. advisors and the opportunity for Americans to work closely with the Chileans. Since 1969, the agency had been establishing intelligence assets in all three branches of the Chilean armed services, and included command-level officers, field and company-grade officers, retired general staff officers, and enlisted men. Employing its usual blend of real and fabricated information, along with forged documents, the CIA endeavored to keep the officers on the alert. One approach was to convince them that, with Allende's approval, the Police Investigations Unit was acting in concert with Cuban intelligence to gather information prejudicial to the Army High Command. Newspapers in Santiago supported by the CIA, particularly El Mercurio, often concentrated on influencing the military. They alleged communist plots to disband or destroy the armed services, Soviet plans to establish a submarine base in Chile, North Korea setting up a training base, and so forth. The papers stirred up hatred against the government in the ranks, and in some cases entire columns were published which were calculated to change the opinion of a single officer, in one case an officer's wife. The agency also subsidized a number of books and other kinds of publications in Chile. One was a short-lived anti-government newsletter directed at the military. Later, the CIA made use of a weekly humor and political magazine, SIPA, aimed at the same audience. The cover of the March 20th, 1973 issue featured the headline, Robert Moss, an English recipe for Chile military control. Moss was identified by the magazine as a British sociologist. A more relevant description would have been that he was a news specialist associated with known CIA media fronts. One of these, Forum World Features of London, see Western Europe chapter, published Moss's book, Chile's Marxist Experiment, in 1973, which was widely circulated by the junta to justify its coup. Moss was associated with a CIA-funded think tank in Santiago which went by the supremely innocuous name of the Institute of General Studies. The IGS, amongst other activities, conducted seminars for Chilean military officers in which it was explained, in technical apolitical terms, why Allende was a disaster for the economy and why a laissez-faire system offered a solution to Chile's ills. There is no way of measuring to what extent such lectures influenced future actions of the military, although after the coup the junta did appoint several IGS people to top government posts. The CIA's Santiago station was meanwhile collecting the operational intelligence necessary in the event of a coup. Arrest lists, key civilian installations and personnel that needed protection, key government installations which need to be taken over, and government contingency plans which would be used in case of a military uprising. The CIA later asserted that this information was never passed to the Chilean military, a claim that does not give one the feeling of having been united with the probable. It should be noted in this context that in the days immediately following the coup, the Chilean military went directly to the residences of many Americans and other foreigners living in Santiago who had been sympathetic to the Allende government. The government contingency plans were presumably obtained by the agency through its infiltration of the various parties which made up Allende's Unidad Popular, UP, coalition. CIA agents in the upper echelons of Allende's own Socialist Party were paid to make mistakes in their jobs. In Washington, burglary was the agency's tactic of choice for obtaining documents. Papers were taken from the homes of several employees of the Chilean embassy, and the embassy itself, which had been bugged for some time, was burgled in May 1972 by some of the same men who the next month staged the Watergate break-in. In March 1973, the UP won about 44% of the vote in congressional elections, compared to some 36% in 1970. It was said to be the largest increase an incumbent party had ever received in Chile after being in power more than 2 years. The opposition parties had publicly expressed their optimism about capturing 2/3 of the congressional seats and thus being able to impeach Allende. Now they faced 3 more years under him, with the prospect of being unable, despite their best and most underhanded efforts, to prevent his popularity from increasing even further. During the spring and summer, the destabilization process escalated. There was a whole series of demonstrations and strikes, with an even longer one by the truckers. Time magazine reported, while most of the country survived on short rations, the truckers seemed unusually well equipped for a lengthy holdout. A reporter asked a group of truckers who were camping and dining on a lavish communal meal of steak, vegetables, wine, and empanadas, where the money for it came from. From the CIA, they answered laughingly. There was as well daily sabotage and violence, including assassination. In June, an abortive attack upon the presidential palace was carried out by the military and Patria y Libertad. In September, the military prevailed. It is clear, said the Senate Investigating Committee, the CIA received intelligence reports on the coup planning of the group, which carried out the successful September 11th coup throughout the months of July, August, and September 1973. The American role on that fateful day was one of substance and shadow. The coup began in the Pacific coast port of Valparaiso with the dispatch of Chilean naval troops to Santiago, while U.S. Navy ships were present offshore, ostensibly to participate in joint maneuvers with the Chilean Navy. The American ships stayed outside of Chilean waters, but remained on the alert. A U.S. WB-575 plane, an airborne communications control system, piloted by U.S. Air Force officers, cruised in the Chilean sky. At the same time, 32 American observation and fighter planes were landing at the U.S. Air Base in Mendoza, Argentina, not far from the Chilean border. In Valparaiso, while U.S. military officers were meeting with their Chilean counterparts, a young American, Charles Horman, who lived in Santiago and was stranded near Valparaiso by the coup, happened to engage in conversation with several Americans, civilian and military. A retired naval engineer told him, "We came down to do a job, and it's done." 1 or 2 American military men also gave away clues they shouldn't have. A few days later, Horman was arrested in his Santiago residence. They knew where to find him. He was never seen again. Thus it was that they closed the country to the outside world for a week, while the tanks rolled and the soldiers broke down doors. The stadiums rang with the sounds of execution, and the bodies piled up along the streets and floated in the river. The torture centers opened for business. The subversive books were thrown to the bonfires. Soldiers slit the trouser legs of women, shouting that in Chile women wear dresses. The poor returned to their natural state, and the men of the world in Washington and in the halls of international finance opened up their checkbooks. 1 year later, President Gerald Ford was moved to declare that what the United States had done in Chile was in the best interest of the people in Chile, and certainly in our own best interest. The remark could have been punctuated with a pinch of snuff. What the United States had done in Chile, thought Gerald Ford, or so he said, was to help and assist the preservation of opposition newspapers and electronic media, and to preserve opposition political parties. The reporters present were kind or obsequious, enough not to ask Ford what he thought of the junta's Chile, where all opposition, of any kind, in any form, in any medium, was forbidden. It was of course de rigueur for some other officials and congressmen to assert that what the United States had really done in Chile was repel the Soviet threat to the Western Hemisphere. But Soviet behavior toward the Allende government simply did not tally with any such hypothesis. The language of U.S. intelligence reports confirms that, Soviet overtures to Allende characterized by caution and restraint. Soviet desire to avoid another Cuba-type commitment. Russians advising Allende to put his relations with the United States in order to ease the strain between the two countries. A CIA study of September 7, 1970, 3 days after Allende's electoral victory, concluded, 1. The U.S. has no vital national interests within Chile. There would, however, be tangible economic losses. 2. The world military balance of power would not be significantly altered by an Allende government. 3. An Allende victory would, however, create considerable political and psychological costs. Hemispheric cohesion would be threatened by the challenge that an Allende government would pose to the OAS Organization of American States, and by the reactions that it would create in other countries. B. An Allende victory would represent a definite psychological setback to the U.S. and a definite psychological advantage for the Marxist idea. The tangible economic losses likely referred to the expected nationalization of U.S. copper mining companies. This in fact occurred with no compensation paid to the companies by the Unidad Popular, which calculated that due to excess profits, over many years the companies actually owed Chile money. The reactions that it would create in other countries. What can this mean but that the people of other countries might be inspired to consider their own socialist solution to the economic and social problems that beset them? Allende's Chile might thus turn out to be that specter that haunted the corridors of official Washington, a successful example of an alternative to the capitalist model. Washington knows no heresy in the Third World but independence. In the case of Salvador Allende, independence came clothed in an especially provocative costume, a Marxist constitutionally elected who continued to honor the Constitution. This would not do. It shook the very foundation stones upon which the anti-communist tower is built. The doctrine, painstakingly cultivated for decades, that communists can take power only through force and deception, that they can retain that power only through terrorizing and brainwashing the population. There could be only one thing worse than a Marxist in power, an elected Marxist in power. 35. Greece 1964 to 1974. Fuck your parliament and your constitution, said the President of the United States. It's the best damn government since Pericles, the American two-star general declared. The news report did not mention whether he was chewing on a big fat cigar. The government, about which the good general was so ebullient, was that of the colonel's junta, which came to power in a military coup in April 1967, followed immediately by the traditional martial law, censorship, arrests, beatings, torture, and killings, the victims totaling some 8,000 in the first month. This was accompanied by the equally traditional declaration that this was all being done to save the nation from a communist takeover. Corrupting and subversive influences in Greek life were to be removed. Among these were miniskirts, long hair, and foreign newspapers. Church attendance for the young would be compulsory. So brutal and so swift was the repression that by September, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and the Netherlands were before the European Commission of Human Rights to accuse Greece of violating most of the Commission's conventions. Before the year was over, Amnesty International had sent representatives to Greece to investigate the situation. From this came a report which asserted that torture as a deliberate practice is carried out by the security police and the military police. The coup had taken place 2 days before the campaign for national elections was to begin, elections which appeared certain to bring the veteran liberal leader George Papandreou back as prime minister. Papandreou had been elected in February 1964 with the only outright majority in the history of modern Greek elections. The successful machinations to unseat him had begun immediately, a joint effort of the royal court, the Greek military, and the American military and CIA stationed in Greece. Philip Dean, the pen name of Gerasimos Gigantes, is a Greek, a former UN official, who worked during this period both for King Constantine and as an envoy to Washington for the Papandreou government. He has written an intimate account of the subtleties and the grossness of this conspiracy to undermine the government and enhance the position of the military plotters, and of the raw power exercised by the CIA in his country. We saw earlier how Greece was looked upon much as a piece of property to be developed according to Washington's needs. A story related by Dean illustrates how this attitude was little changed, and thus the precariousness of Papandreou's position. During one of the perennial disputes between Greece and Turkey over Cyprus, which was now spilling over onto NATO, President Johnson summoned the Greek ambassador to tell him of Washington's solution. The ambassador protested that it would be unacceptable to the Greek parliament and contrary to the Greek constitution. "Then listen to me, Mr. Ambassador," said the President of the United States. "Fuck your parliament and your constitution. America is an elephant. Cyprus is a flea. If these two fleas continue itching the elephant, they may just get whacked by the elephant's trunk, whacked good. We pay a lot of good American dollars to the Greeks, Mr. Ambassador. If your Prime Minister gives me talk about democracy, parliament, and constitutions, his parliament and his constitution may not last very long." In July 1965, George Papandreou was finally maneuvered out of office by royal prerogative. The king had a coalition of breakaway center union deputies, Papandreou's party, and rightists waiting in the wings to form a new government. It was later revealed by a State Department official that the CIA chief of station in Athens, he helped King Constantine by center union deputies so that the George Papandreou government was toppled. For nearly 2 years thereafter, various short-lived cabinets ruled until it was no longer possible to avoid holding the elections prescribed by the Constitution. What concerned the opponents of George Papandreou most about him was his son, Andreas Papandreou, who had been head of the economics department at the University of California at Berkeley and a minister in his father's cabinet, was destined for a leading role in the new government, but he was by no means the wide-eyed radical. In the United States, Andreas had been an active supporter of such quintessential moderate liberals as Adlai Stevenson and Hubert Humphrey. His economic views, wrote Washington Post columnist Marquis Childs, were those of the American New Deal, but Andreas Papandreou did not disguise his wish to take Greece out of the Cold War. He publicly questioned the wisdom of the country remaining in NATO, or at least remaining in it as a satellite of the United States. He leaned toward opening relations with the Soviet Union and other communist countries on Greece's border. He argued that the swollen American military and intelligence teams in Greece compromised the nation's freedom of action, and he viewed the Greek army as a threat to democracy, wishing to purge it of its most dictatorial and royalist-minded senior officers. Andreas Papandreou's bark was worse than his bite, as his later presidency was to amply demonstrate. He did not, for example, pull Greece out of NATO or US bases out of Greece. But in Lyndon Johnson's Washington, if you were not totally and unquestioningly with us, you were egging us. Johnson felt that Andreas, who had become a naturalized US citizen, had betrayed America. Said LBJ, "We gave the son of a bitch American citizenship, didn't we? He was an American with all the rights and privileges, and he had sworn allegiance to the flag, and then he gave up his American citizenship. He went back to just being a Greek. You can't trust a man who breaks his oath of allegiance to the flag of these United States." What, then, are we to make of the fact that Andreas Papandreou was later reported to have worked with the CIA in the early 1960s? He criticized publication of the report, but did not deny the charge. If true, it would not have been incompatible with being a liberal, particularly at that time. It was incompatible, as he subsequently learned, only with his commitment to a Greece independent from US foreign policy. As for the elder Papandreou, his anti-communist credentials were impeccable, dating back to his role as a British-installed prime minister during the Civil War against the left in 1944 to 45. But he, too, showed stirrings of independence from the Western superpower. He refused to buckle under Johnson's pressure to compromise with Turkey over Cyprus. He accepted an invitation to visit Moscow, and when his government said that it would accept Soviet aid in preparation for a possible war with Turkey, the US Embassy demanded an explanation. Moreover, in an attempt to heal the old wounds of the Civil War, Papandreou began to reintroduce certain civil liberties and to readmit into Greece some of those who had fought against the government in the Civil War period. When Andreas Papandreou assumed his ministerial duties in 1964, he was shocked to discover what was becoming a fact of life for every techno-industrial state in the world. An intelligence service gone wild, a shadow government with powers beyond the control of the nation's nominal leaders. This, thought Papandreou, accounted for many of the obstacles the government was encountering in trying to carry out its policies. The Greek intelligence service, KYP, as we have seen, was created by the OSS/CIA in the course of the Civil War, with hundreds of its officers receiving training in the United States. One of these men, George Papadopoulos, was the leader of the junta that seized power in 1967. Andreas Papandreou found that the KYP routinely bugged ministerial conversations and turned the data over to the CIA. Many Western intelligence agencies have long provided the CIA with information about their own government and citizens, and the CIA has reciprocated on occasion. The nature of much of this information has been such that if a private citizen were to pass it to a foreign power, he could be charged with treason. As a result of his discovery, the younger Papandreou dismissed the two top KYP men and replaced them with reliable officers. The new director was ordered to protect the cabinet from surveillance. He came back apologetically, recalls Papandreou, to say he couldn't do it. All the equipment was American, controlled by the CIA or Greeks under CIA supervision. There was no kind of distinction between the two services. They duplicated functions in a counterpart relationship. In effect, they were a single agency. Andreas Papandreou's order to abolish the bugging of the cabinet inspired the deputy chief of mission of the U.S. Embassy, Norbert Anschutz, or Anschutz, to visit him. Anschutz, who has been linked to the CIA, demanded that Papandreou rescind the order. Andreas demanded that the American leave his office, which he did, but not before warning that there would be consequences. Papandreou then requested that a thorough search be made of his home and office for electronic devices by the new KYP deputy director. It wasn't until much later, says Andreas, that we discovered he'd simply planted a lot of new bugs. Lo and behold, we'd brought in another American-paid operative as our number two. An endeavor by Andreas to end the practice of KYP's funds coming directly from the CIA without passing through any Greek ministry also met with failure. But he did succeed in transferring the man who had been liaison between the two agencies for several years. This was George Papadopoulos. The change in his position, however, appears to have amounted to little more than a formality, for the organization still took orders from him. Even afterwards, Greek opposition politicians who sought the ear or the purse of James Potts, CIA deputy chief in Athens before the coup, were often told, "See George, he's my boy." In mid-February 1967, a meeting took place in the White House, reported Mark E. Childs, to discuss CIA reports which left no doubt that a military coup was in the making could hardly have been a secret. Since 1947, the Greek army and the American military aid group in Athens, numbering several hundred, have worked as part of the same team. The solemn question was whether by some subtle political intervention the coup could be prevented, and thus preserve parliamentary government. It was decided that no course of action was feasible. As one of the senior civilians present recalls it, Walt Rostow, the president's advisor on national security affairs, closed the meeting with these words: "I hope you understand, gentlemen, that what we have concluded here, or rather have failed to conclude, makes the future course of events in Greece inevitable." A CIA report dated January 23, 1967 had specifically named the Papadopoulos group as one plotting a coup, and was apparently one of the reports discussed at the February meeting. Of the cabal of 5 officers which took power in April, 4 reportedly were intimately connected to the American military or to the CIA in Greece. The 5th man had been brought in because of the armored units he commanded. George Papadopoulos emerged as the de facto leader, taking the title of Prime Minister later in the year. The catchword amongst old hands at the U.S. military mission in Greece was that Papadopoulos was the first CIA agent to become premier of a European country. Many Greeks consider this to be the simple truth, reported Charles Foley in The Observer of London. At the time of the coup, Papadopoulos had been on the CIA payroll for some 15 years. One reason for the success of their marriage may have been Colonel Papadopoulos' World War II record. When the Germans invaded Greece, Papadopoulos served as a captain in the Nazi security battalions whose main task was to track down Greek resistance fighters. He was, it is said, a great believer in Hitler's New Order, and his later record in power did little to cast doubt upon that claim. Foley writes that when he mentioned the junta leader's pro-German background to an American military advisor he met at a party in Athens, the American hinted that it was related to Papadopoulos' subservience to U.S. wishes. "George gives good value," he smiled, "because there are documents in Washington he wouldn't like let out." Foley relates that under Papadopoulos, Intense official propaganda portrayed communism as the only enemy Greece had ever had and minimized the German occupation until even Nazi atrocities were seen as provoked by the communists. This rewriting of history clearly reflects the dictator's concern at the danger that the gap in his official biography may someday be filled in. As part of the rewriting, members of the security battalions became heroes of the resistance. It was torture, however, which most indelibly marked the 7-year Greek nightmare. James Beckett, an American attorney sent to Greece by Amnesty International, wrote in December 1969 that a conservative estimate would place at not less than 2,000 the number of people tortured. It was an odious task for Beckett to talk to some of the victims. People had been mercilessly tortured simply for being in possession of a leaflet criticizing the regime. Brutality and cruelty on one side, frustration and helplessness on the other. They were being tortured and there was nothing to be done. It was like listening to a friend who has cancer. What comfort, what wise reflection can someone who is comfortable give? Torture might last a short time, but the person will never be the same. Beckett reported that some torturers had told prisoners that some of their equipment had come as U.S. military aid. A special thick white double cable whip was one item. Another was the head screw, known as an iron wreath, which was progressively tightened around the head or ears. The Amnesty delegation described a number of the other torture methods commonly employed. Among these were beating the soles of the feet with a stick or pipe. After 4 months of this, the soles of one prisoner were covered with thick scar tissue. Another was crippled by broken bones. Numerous incidents of sexually oriented torture, shoving fingers or an object into the vagina and twisting and tearing brutally, also done with the anus, or a tube is inserted into the anus and water driven in under very high pressure. C. Techniques of gagging. The throat is grasped in such a way that the windpipe is cut off, or a filthy rag, often soaked in urine and sometimes excrement, is shoved down the throat. D. Tearing out the hair from the head and the pubic region. E. Jumping on the stomach. F. Pulling out toenails and fingernails. These were not the worst. The worst is what one reads in the many individual testimonies. But these are simply too lengthy to be repeated here. The junta's response to the first amnesty report was to declare that it was comprised of charges emanating from international communism and to hire public relations firms in New York and London to improve its image. In 1969, the European Commission of Human Rights found Greece guilty of torture, murder, and other violations. For these reasons, and particularly for the junta's abolition of parliamentary democracy, the Council of Europe, a consultative body of, at that time, 18 European states, under which the Commission falls, was preparing to expel Greece. The Council rejected categorically Greece's claim that it had been in danger of a communist takeover. Amnesty International later reported that the United States, though not a member of the Council, actively applied diplomatic pressure on member states not to vote for the expulsion. Nonetheless, while the Council was deliberating, the New York Times reported that the State Department said today that the United States had deliberately avoided taking any position on the question of continued Greek membership in the Council of Europe. The European members, said Amnesty, believed that only the United States had the power to bring about changes in Greece, yet it chose only to defend the junta. On the specific